Hello again, Bee here. Since we learned about carbohydrates in the previous lesson, I've been paying more attention to the types and amounts of carbohydrates in the foods I eat. Gotta get that fiber. But I've noticed that there are other rows I still don't understand. For example, total fat. There are 12 grams of fat in a serving of this food. There are also subcategories of fat. I wonder how saturated fat is different from trans fat. And why don't they add up to the amount of total fat? Then there's cholesterol, which is in its own category. I've heard a lot of talk about fats and cholesterol being bad. Does that mean I should avoid them as much as possible? Or like with carbohydrates, is the real story more complex? We need to learn about another category of macromolecules called lipids to find out. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to characterize lipids, describe the structure and function of triglycerides, and describe the structure and function of phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. Last time we explored carbohydrates, which are one of the 4 groups of organic macromolecules found in living things. Today we'll look at the next category, lipids. Like carbohydrates, lipids are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms bonded together. And also, like carbohydrates, not all lipids are the same. We saw that carbohydrates are polar molecules because they have lots of oxygen-hydrogen bonds which create charged regions around the molecule. This polarity allows carbohydrates, particularly the small simple sugars, to dissolve in polar substances like water. The ability for sugars to dissolve in water is very important to their functioning in the body. But what about lipids? We'll discover that even though lipids have different structures and functions, they all have one important trait in common. They're mostly non-polar, meaning that lipid molecules are not charged. Well, with a few exceptions. We'll get to that. And unlike polar sugars, which can dissolve in water, non-polar lipids do not dissolve in water. You've probably seen what happens if you mix oil, which is a lipid, with water. The oil does not dissolve. Instead, the oil stays together in patches or blobs. Due to water's polarity, H2O molecules are just way more attracted to each other than they are to the lipid molecules. So they do not surround and pull the lipid molecules away from each other. This is why you can't clean an oily pan with just water. The water can't dissolve oil like it can salt or sugar. Since lipids can't dissolve in water, it may seem like being nonpolar is an unfortunate quality for biological molecules to have. But the opposite is true. It's important for organisms to have some substances that do not dissolve in water. Otherwise, every time an organism got wet, it would dissolve. And since all life requires water, being unable to touch water would make survival difficult. We'll see later in this lesson and in later units that lipids' ability to not dissolve in water is very important to living things. And even though lipids may not dissolve in polar substances, they can dissolve or dissolve in other nonpolar substances. The pattern is commonly referred to as like dissolves like, meaning that polar substances dissolve in polar substances, and nonpolar substances dissolve in nonpolar substances. Another way to say this is that polar substances are soluble in polar substances and nonpolar substances are soluble in nonpolar substances. For example, vitamins are divided into two categories: water-soluble and fat-soluble. The water-soluble vitamins are polar molecules, so they can be dissolved and transported in water-based fluids in our bodies. The fat-soluble vitamins are nonpolar, so they can only dissolve in nonpolar lipids like fat. Being able to dissolve important nonpolar substances is another reason why lipids are important for life. All right, lipids are nonpolar molecules which do not dissolve in water, but can dissolve or dissolve in nonpolar substances. Now, let's look at the types of lipids in more detail, beginning with the triglycerides, more commonly known as fats. What are triglycerides? Based on the prefix tri, we can guess that it has three of something. Glyceride gives us a hint too. Triglycerides are made of a molecule called glycerol, connected to three other molecules called fatty acids. And what elements make up this triglyceride molecule? Carbon, surprise, surprise, surrounded by hydrogen atoms and a few oxygen atoms. Triglycerides are commonly known as fats. Their primary role in the body is to store energy for later use. You may have heard of different kinds of fats, such as saturated fats and unsaturated fats. What's the difference? It comes down to how the carbon atoms in the fatty acid chains are bonded together. Let's look at some fatty acids in more detail. Here are two different fatty acid chains: a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid. In the saturated fatty acid, all of the carbon atoms are connected by single bonds. Remember that carbon atoms participate in 4 shared electron pairs. In the saturated fatty acid, all carbons meet this requirement by forming 2 single bonds with other carbons and 2 single bonds with hydrogens. The carbon chain is bonded to as many hydrogens as possible. In other words, the fatty acid is saturated with hydrogen atoms. On the other hand, the unsaturated fatty acid contains a double bond. Since a double bond involves 2 shared electron pairs, the 2 carbon atoms involved in the double bond can only bond to 1 hydrogen each, not 2. Since the chain does not contain as many hydrogens as it possibly could, the fatty acid is considered unsaturated. And because this fatty acid contains only 1 double bond, it is called monounsaturated. Do you notice anything different about the shapes of these 2 fatty acids? The saturated molecule has a straight shape, whereas the double bond gives the unsaturated molecule a kinked, meaning bent shape. A fatty acid may also contain more than 1 double bond, like the one shown here. Such fats are called polyunsaturated fats. They have even more kinks than monounsaturated fats. The different shapes of these fatty acids have major implications for the triglycerides which contain them. Let's look at 2 examples. This triglyceride molecule contains 3 saturated fatty acids. Since all 3 carbon chains are straight, saturated fat molecules are able to easily pack together, leading them to be solid at room temperature. For example, butter and coconut oil contain a lot of saturated fat and are solid at room temperature. Now let's look at a triglyceride molecule, which contains unsaturated fatty acids. The double bonds result in kinked chains, which cannot pack together as easily as saturated fats can. This leads to unsaturated fats being liquids at room temperature. For example, olive oil and sunflower oil are unsaturated fats and are liquid at room temperature. So, are triglycerides healthy or not? There is still much debate among scientists, nutritionists, and doctors regarding how much of each fat type we should consume. Some research suggests that eating too much saturated fat can contribute to heart disease and other health problems, while other studies have not found such links. On the other hand, most agree though that foods rich in unsaturated fats are good for us. These include olives and olive oil, avocados, nuts, and seeds. And all experts agree on one point. Trans fats are very unhealthy, and we should avoid them completely. But wait, we didn't talk about trans fats before. That's because trans fats are artificially created. The process starts with unsaturated oil. Hydrogen gas is pumped through the unsaturated fats, which forces the double-bonded carbons to grab an additional hydrogen, losing their double bonds and kinks in the process. When done completely, this process produces a saturated fat with a more solid consistency than the starting oil. The more solid fat is convenient for many highly processed foods, particularly packaged pastries and fried foods. However, for a long time, the fats produced in this way were only partially hydrogenated, meaning that not all of the double bonds were replaced with an extra hydrogen. Some of the double bonds that remained got twisted into what's called a trans configuration. This means that the double bond is still present, but the fatty acid has a straight shape rather than a bent shape. It was long thought that trans fats were a healthier alternative to saturated fats. However, scientists have since discovered that trans fats are far unhealthier than saturated fats and should be avoided as much as possible. Trans fats are so problematic that the Food and Drug Administration has banned the use of artificial trans fats in American food products. Still, the high temperatures used in frying oils common at fast food restaurants can cause some unsaturated fats to turn into trans fats. And the longer the frying oil is used, the more trans fats accumulate. One more reason to avoid fried fast food. Now that we know more about fats, let's revisit our nutrition label. There are 2 grams of saturated fatty acids in a serving of this food. We now know that those are fatty acids with all single bonds between carbons, which are saturated with hydrogens and have a straight shape. And there are 0 trans fats in this food, which is good since we know they are unhealthy. But 2 plus 0 doesn't add up to the 12 grams of total fat. Any ideas what the other 10 grams are? If you said unsaturated fats, you are correct. These may be monounsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, or both. And a small amount of the leftover mass is the glycerol that all these fatty acids are connected to form triglycerides. Woo! Who knew there was so much to learn about fats? And guess what? There's more to the lipid story. Though fats may get a lot of attention in nutrition conversations, they are not the only type of lipid. Let's look at the others beginning with phospholipids. Phospholipids have a similar structure to triglycerides, with one key difference. Triglycerides consist of glycerol connected to 3 fatty acid chains. Phospholipids consist of glycerol connected to two fatty acids. These are the tails. The third spot is occupied by a head, which contains a phosphate group, hence the name phospholipid. That one orange atom is a phosphorus atom. Remember earlier when I mentioned that lipids are mostly nonpolar, with an exception? Well, we've arrived at the exception. The fatty acids in a phospholipid are still nonpolar, but the phosphate group has charged regions and is polar. This arrangement gives phospholipids the unique property of having a polar head and nonpolar tails. As you'll learn about in Unit 3, the structure of phospholipids makes them very important in cell membranes. Next on the lipids list is steroids. The structure of steroids is quite different from the lipids we've seen so far. Still, steroids are considered lipids because they are mostly nonpolar. Steroid molecules consist of 4 fused carbon rings, sometimes with a short tail. This is cholesterol, the most abundant steroid in our bodies. See the 4 carbon rings in the molecule? Like phospholipids, cholesterol serves a critical role in cell membranes, which we'll discuss further in Unit 3. Cholesterol also serves as the precursor or starting material for other important molecules our bodies make. 2 examples are the steroids testosterone and estradiol. Notice the characteristic steroid structure of 4 fused rings. These steroids act as hormones, meaning they are chemical messengers in the body which regulate growth, development, and much more. These steroids are present and important in both males and females. When you hear the word steroid, you may think of prohibited substances that some dishonest athletes use to increase muscle mass. Those steroids are actually synthetic drugs that mimic the natural testosterone steroid. The drugs have some beneficial applications, for example, in patients with certain diseases, but have negative side effects when abused. You may have also heard that cholesterol is bad, but its role in cell membranes and as a precursor for other key steroid molecules makes cholesterol essential in our bodies. Our livers produce enough cholesterol to meet all of our body's needs. However, cholesterol is also present in animal products like meat and dairy. For example, a serving of this food contains 8 milligrams of cholesterol. The research regarding cholesterol consumed through diet has produced mixed results. There is some evidence to suggest that consuming too much cholesterol is unhealthy and can contribute to heart disease. However, other studies have not found this link. Now, on to our last type of lipid, waxes. Waxes have varying structures but typically consist of long carbon chains. Like the other lipids, waxes are nonpolar molecules and therefore do not dissolve in water. This makes waxes useful as waterproof barriers. For example, this is ceramide, a waxy lipid which is an important part of our epidermis, the outermost layer of our skin. Ceramides help keep moisture in our skin from escaping so our skin doesn't dry out. Many plants also have waxy coatings to prevent them from losing water. One example is the carnauba palm tree. The waxy coating on carnauba palm fronds prevents the leaves from drying out. But the trees are not the only ones who benefit from this wax. Humans collect carnauba wax and use it to polish cars, coat dental floss, and much more. Bees are also well known for their production and use of wax. Honeybees secrete beeswax, which they use to form their hexagonal combs. Beeswax is the perfect material for this purpose because it is soft enough for the bees to shape, but still solid. The nonpolar nature of beeswax is critical too, since bees deposit honey into the combs. Honey is a mixture of polar sugar and water molecules. The polar molecules in honey and nonpolar beeswax molecules do not dissolve each other, creating the perfect little containers for the bees' sweet food. Whoa, that was a lot of information about lipids. Good thing you and I have energy stored in our triglycerides. All that thinking requires a lot of energy. We now know that lipids are mostly nonpolar macromolecules. Triglycerides, aka fats, store energy and may be saturated or unsaturated. And phospholipids, steroids, and waxes are other categories of lipids with varying structures and roles. In the next lesson, we'll look at another category of macromolecule on our nutrition label: protein. Until then, remember, biology is more than just science, it's the way of life. See you next time.